Hello to everyone watching and listening today to this the Gruyter book talk. My name is Rabea. I'm Senior Acquisitions Editor with the History Department at the Gruyter, and joining me today is Dr. Esther Wright, a lecturer in digital history at Cardiff University. Thank you so much for being here, Esther. It's a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
Definitely. We're going to talk about your book that's I think went into production just a couple of days ago, and going to be published in late August 22nd. So mark that in your calendars, everyone. And the book is called Rockstar Games and American History, Promotional Materials and the Construction of Authenticity, and will also be published in our book series, Video Games and the Humanities. So, again, thank you so much for coming. Even though, well, from what I understand, the sun is currently melting every living thing, not being in a fridge. But yeah, since we're here today to talk about your book and also your research, maybe best start by telling all of us what the book is about.
So on the face of it, or in the most kind of basic way I can put it, I guess, the book is about Rockstar Games. It's about the representation of American history in Rockstar Games, but more specifically, or getting a bit more specific, it looks in particular at two of Rockstar's most kind of deliberately or obviously historical, or perhaps uncontroversially historical titles. So looking in particular at Red Dead Redemption and Noire. And yeah, it's kind of looking at, as I said, the way that Rockstar sought to negotiate those kind of early to mid 20th century aspects of American culture and society and history through their games, but also really sort of digging into the way that they marketed the game. So looking really at how understandings of American history, sort of ideas about American cultural history, how all of those things were used in the sort of the wider promotional paratextual surround of the games to try and really stake these claims for authenticity.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very great summary of what the book's about.
I try to keep it as succinct as possible because I could go on a lot of different tangents, but yeah.
Yeah. And it's super fascinating to read, even for a non-gamer like me, because of the authenticity debate behind it. But maybe first, let's talk a bit about the games, just for people who don't know what the games are and what they are about. You focus on two, Red Dead Redemption and LA Noire, as you just said. So I understand the one is a Western and one is about, film noir, basically, the 30s.
Sure.
So yeah, maybe start with that.
Yeah. So really what kind of got me interested in sort of, or really was kind of part of the rationale of me focusing on Rockstar in the first place, is that I've always really been very interested in the way that American history was represented by the media. So I started off by looking at, much earlier in my kind of scholarly journey, or whatever you want to call it, looking at kind of film and television. But then when I came to my PhD, sort of focusing on games, and really sort of, if I wanted to combine all of those interests, looking at kind of popular culture, popular media, like sort of film and television, and sort of history and games, there's not really a better kind of company to look at than Rockstar, or really a company that's been doing these kinds of things and combining these things in interesting ways than Rockstar. So their games, all of their games, are sort of very deliberately historical, but very deliberately kind of culturally anchored. So as you say, the Red Dead series is very much sort of anchored within the wider genre of the Western, and really kind of preoccupied with a very particular period in the Western's history, sort of that post-1960s kind of slightly different sort of era of the Western, where things got a little bit sort of darker and cynical and kind of grittier, or at least that's the kind of popular idea about revisionism in the Western. So it's very much American history, American kind of Western and frontier history through Red Dead Redemption, and for Rockstar then is very much that period of the sort of the late 19th, early 20th century through those kinds of Western films, and how those kind of films are as much the sort of anchor point as any sort of real history, if we dare say real history. The Wild Bunch is as much a kind of cultural anchor as anything else for them, as well as the sort of more traditional historical anchors. Excuse me. And so for L.A. Noire, it's a very similar sort of thing. It's the 1940s, kind of post-war American Los Angeles, really through the lens of sort of film noir, but in particular neo-noir. So trying to very much be a kind of classic film noir sort of product, set in the 1940s, very much about the seediness and the darkness of the city, and the white male investigator being there, these very kind of popular associations with detectives and femme fatales of the sort of noir genre. But again, it's kind of it's film noir and the 1940s through the lens of really neo-noir, through the kinds of noir films that were made again sort of after the 1960s, 1970s, beginning with kind of Chinatown, that were deliberately trying to be of that period. We're trying to offer something historical and have the look and feel of that period. So there are all these different interesting levels of kind of mediation and remediation in what Rockstar are kind of doing in trying to represent something very historical about a particular space and time, but doing so by bringing in a lot of the reference points of the way that other kinds of popular culture have been trying to do that ever since, if that makes sense.
Yes, a lot. I think it's a super fascinating topic because we all have our definition of what authenticity means. And specifically when it's about Western, we all look for, I don't know, the 70s, 60s, 70s Hollywood Western and their depiction of what was authentic Western culture. And we all know that not all cowboys wore that hat, and that the horses you see in the movie pretty much weren't the ones they actually used in the West in the 19th century, but it's still so deeply engraved in us from seeing it over and over again that it's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about it. And that Rockstar used that to market their own game is fascinating. And because you mentioned it, paratexts, maybe it's worth explaining what you mean by that.
Yeah, sure. So the way that paratext as a term has kind of taken on a lot of different sort of weird and wonderful meanings to lots of different people, but the way that I kind of conceptualize and use it in the book is really by focusing on sort of Rockstar created mostly digital materials and some sort of physical materials that sort of sit at really the kind of conventional edges of the games. So anything that sort of is not the game itself that you play on your console or PC or whatever. So thinking about digital kind of promotional materials, looking at things like trailers, developer interviews, content that was kind of posted on the Rockstar website. So all of these kinds of ways that Rockstar were trying to position the games to potential players or to fans before they'd even come out. And this is something that's really sort of interesting in terms of the way that they tried to negotiate this idea of authenticity, the way they tried to sort of draw on a particular kind of Western, I guess, sort of popular memory, I suppose, or the sort of ideas about the Western and also about kind of film noir and the kind of the post-war America. They did that sort of, as I said, specifically through various kinds of paratexts or promotional materials. I guess you could kind of see them as promotional materials, particularly on the Rockstar website, in creating sort of content that came out far, before either of the games came out, that was sort of recommending films for players to watch to sort of get in the mood to play the game. So that tells us something very interesting about the kind of cultural and historical reference points that, a developer like Rockstar was kind of drawing on. If they're trying to sort of show they're working out almost to players, sort of show these are the kinds of films that we think are sort of best representative of the Western as we see it. These are the kinds of films that you can kind of watch to look at kind of Western history, to get into Western history, whether that's the history of, the 19th century West or the mid 20th century West. That was really interesting for me, and an interesting sort of almost insight into, if not production, at least into the sort of the selling of these games, and what the company actually thought, or what the kind of marketing for the company thought players would sort of be most interested in, I guess.
Yeah. And I find it super interesting to see that this is an interpretation that's Rockstar's interpretation of the past, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did with it, and that they turned to movie to tell the world we are right, because you can see in that movie they are telling the same story, which is interesting because it might not always have been that way. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, but Hollywood used to be the bigger seller between both of them, and that has been turned around, not only because of the pandemic, but that probably did have an influence as well. But video games, and especially Rockstar, is far more influential globally than Hollywood. So do you think that this has been turned around now? That while Rockstar looked at Hollywood to sell their games, now Hollywood looks at Rockstar or other developers to sell their movies?
Yeah, no, I would definitely say so. I think it's really interesting that around the kinds of promotional materials that I look at are really sort of focused around 2009 to 2011. So it's really interesting, and I guess it's part of kind of Rockstar's wider brand that they're a kind of a company, or their executives at least, are sort of obsessed with movies and sort of popular culture and that kind of thing. So it's sort of it very much makes sense for them to kind of almost like perform this kind of film taste, or perform this kind of like film buff sort of persona or vision, I guess, for the company. But it's very interesting because, even by the point that Red Dead and LA Noire came out, GTA was a whole thing, right? Like, they didn't really have to kind of beyond sort of making assurances that these were new franchises, these were new products, and they could still be sort of trusted, or they could still be trusted that they were in a safe pair of hands. They were still being made by a sort of, by Rockstar, and fans should play them. It's really interesting to have that particular company rely so heavily on sort of using these kind of almost like citations to sort of film history, and to particularly such mostly kind of older films as well, not even that many recent films. But yeah, I mean, we've even seen it sort of more recently in the last couple of years, last sort of 5 or 6 years, with TV shows like Westworld, for example, with Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy particularly talking about being inspired by Red Dead Redemption in making it, and the whole sort of broader, I guess, convergence of various industries between television and sort of film and games, and the way that they're all trying to sort of, particularly television and film, sort of trying to, mimic things that seem to be successful in games, whether that's particular formats or more playful ways of making content, or actual full-on intellectual properties and things like that. And, I'm sure that there's been a very sort of long-running attempt to try and sort of make movies out of Rockstar's games, which I don't think they've been quite so sure about just yet. But yeah, I think their sort of meteoric success, the amount of money that they make, people from all industries, I think, try to sort of see how they can try and emulate that in as many ways as possible, I guess.
Of course, they can make money out of it. Why not?
Sure.
Yeah. But that makes the work of a historian so important, right? To tell, well, it's totally fine if you enjoy playing the game and watching the movie, but this is their interpretation of what happened. There are 1,000 others out there, and just be aware that it's only one of them. So yeah. Sure, yeah. And to maybe finally address the elephant in the room, what is authenticity? Such
a terrible question.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, it's a really good question, actually. And it's something that, you know, in my own small way, I guess the book is explicitly trying to address. But that's the big problem with authenticity, is that it sort of means everything and nothing at the same time. I think, you know, as you said earlier, you know, it means so many different things to so many different people. And, you know, you kind of complicate that a layer when you're then talking about historical media or historical games. And a historian is obviously going to have a completely different perspective on this than somebody making a game, or somebody then playing the game, or, you know, marketing the game, that kind of thing. You know, everyone has an opinion, and that's what's meant to some of the kind of, or a lot of the sort of big fractious sort of debates or things that have happened within the gaming community, sort of online discourse and that kind of thing. So it's, for me, it's sort of more important to understand the kind of, I guess, the context in which it's used and who is actually using it, who is, you know, making these claims. And as I kind of deal with in the book a little bit, making these kind of claims of authenticity are very sort of like performative. They have to be performed by someone, and they have to be then received. So it's about understanding the context and sort of, yeah, whether they are received sort of positively or negatively, I guess, is something that will always sort of change with time and with context, and yeah, will mean different things in different contexts. But it's not what my book is trying to do, really, is not about sort of staking any particular, you know, planting any flag for this is what authenticity is, but really being able to gauge, or trying to gauge, I suppose, or make arguments about, you know, this is what authenticity means for Rockstar, or for this sort of person, or this company, and this is kind of how it's used to sell games. Because obviously authenticity is important. It wouldn't be sort of such a hot commodity, it wouldn't be so talked about, or used so frequently as a kind of as a label or as a branding exercise if it wasn't. So yeah, but it's one of the kind of most notorious and, I guess, flaky terms that even historians don't use in a kind of consistent way. So yeah, the context is always important for me.
It's very much a buzzword, right? That
sure. Yeah.
Just to sound clever, and then hope nobody asks anything about it. But yeah, and I think that very much related to that is, and you also talk about that in the book, is the debate about how authentic are the games in relation to race and ethnicity. Because again, not knowing the games a lot, but knowing the movies the games are based on or relate to, non-white people are not in there a lot. So that's,
yeah, it's kind of the way that the book is sort of structured, and the way I guess it develops is that I start by looking at sort of what is actually in these promotional discourses. So like what kinds of, you know, even in the sort of films that Rockstar were talking about, or the kinds of history that Rockstar were using to sort of say these games are authentic, what is actually in that? Like what's the substance of it? What sort of portrait of post-war Los Angeles or the American West are they trying to kind of paint? And then as it sort of moves through the different chapters, I look at the kind of, I guess, the consequences for who is included in that image and who is not. And yeah, it's very much not really people of color. They are very much the kind of the sort of, you know, as in many kind of historical games or historical media often, and you know, for a long time, many histories, right, just sort of sidelined. And it's not a case of just pointing out, well, they got this wrong, or this isn't accurate or whatever, but there's a level of, well, the kind of authenticity or the kind of image of authenticity they are painting doesn't actually leave any space for them to sort of meaningfully incorporate even groups of people that we actually know, you know, quite commonly know were sort of part of the kind of the American West, like sort of Black cowboys, for example, or Native American groups, obviously. These people who are not exactly left out of the kind of the filmic record of the American West, but who in the game are sort of, they are kind of there, or at least, you know, Native Americans are kind of there, but they are very much not the focal point of these stories, in the same way that, you know, the kind of selections Rockstar were making about sort of films and culture, they were not really the focal point of those stories. So you can kind of trace a through line for sort of these discourses of, you know, perhaps completely unintentional exclusion, but when you have a company who's very sort of committed to making games about white men, essentially it's not super surprising. I suppose it's just a little bit unfortunate that they can't sort of, there's no space within that to sort of include other, you know, other people. And even sort of for a game like Noire, again, you have like the kind of the odd sort of Mexican American characters, or the odd kind of Black characters perhaps, but again, they are very much these sort of like little pinpoints in a Los Angeles that we know was so much more diverse than it, you know, just this central figure of kind of the white male detective. And the problem with the way that these kind of you know, people of color, or sort of othered, I guess, peoples are sort of positioned, is that they are sort of positioned in very sort of stereotypical ways that reinforces some of the kind of problematic nature of what popular culture, what kind of popular memory, I suppose, has sort of has done to the kind of history of these places. And yeah, that's what I suppose gets bundled up as authentic and kind of continue to perpetuate a sort of very marginal or perhaps narrow field of vision in terms of who was actually in these kind of parts of America's past.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not only about white, non-white, it's also about male, female. It is very much centered on the white man of America, basically.
Yeah.
So gender is another heavy aspect of it and of the whole authenticity debate. Yeah. Which brings me to my next question, which is a more personal one, I guess. But being a woman in this whole video game community, and also in the video game researcher community, so in the academic circles, how's that? What's that like?
You know, it's kind of interesting. I was thinking about this, and I sort of, when I was young, when I was sort of a child, I was quite fortunate that my parents didn't kind of really discourage me from playing games or anything. And, you know, I have a younger brother, and they treated us, I would say, pretty equal in terms of, you know, supplying our demand for games and consoles and being kind of playing games and that kind of stuff from quite a young age, actually. So it wasn't really until I was a teenager, I think, that I became sort of aware of any kind of like gender dimension to sort of games and to gaming in particular, sort of being an obviously female teenager on Xbox Live and having particular kinds of experiences with even kind of people that I knew, I guess, treating me differently because I was, you know, a girl. But that never really sort of discouraged me, I guess, from feeling like I was a gamer. I don't know whether, you know, my definition of that is the same as other people's, but, you know, I've always played games. And I once had another sort of more senior academic, not a games academic, but more senior academic, asked me if I'd had a misspent youth playing video games after I kind of explained what my topic was. And I was like, well, I mean, I guess, but then I wouldn't really be doing this if I hadn't. Or, you know, so it probably worked out okay. Maybe it wasn't entirely misspent. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think because in terms of, you know, that sort of identity of being, you know, a woman who has always played games and still, you know, plays games when I actually now have time to play games, which isn't very often. But I think being someone who then also researches and teaches and writes about games, I do have, I think, a kind of inherent nervousness talking about games, just because I'm a woman. I think I have a little bit of a complex about sometimes about how people will take that and whether they will take me as seriously. I think it's possibly a nervousness that I'm sure many colleagues who are men, or at least kind of straight cis men, I guess, don't have necessarily as a baseline anyway. As a, you know, and not something that, you know, always occupies all of my thoughts, but always this kind of nagging thing at the back of your mind, like, oh, you know, I'm about to go and talk about games again, you know, will people take me seriously? And I think especially being a kind of an early career, you know, academic as well, there's the kind of all of that bundled into it. I am quite fortunate. I haven't really had very many or very, very bad experiences. Even in kind of teaching too, I've found that the students I've taught so far have always been kind of really, really engaged, and I haven't had the kinds of experiences that I've heard of kind of other women sort of teachers, or having in terms of talking about games and being a woman in that space. So I think I've possibly been very fortunate to not have had those very bad experiences, but that doesn't mean that I'm not kind of aware of the sorts of experiences that other women have, and always having that sort of there in the back of your mind, which is, it's not an ideal or great thing to have when you just kind of want it to be about the work, but then it is obviously such an important part of who I am, an important part of my perspective and the way that I see things and interpret things, that aspects of this book wouldn't be what they are if I wasn't sort of a woman writing about it and researching it and playing them, right? So yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's an asset. You're an amazing person and a brilliant scholar and writer, by the way.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's incredibly important to keep that up and to push the nagging and doubtful voices as far down as possible. Yeah. So your research as a whole is pretty interdisciplinary, isn't it? It's specifically this book, it's American history, it's game studies, film and media studies, and it's combining everything. And I know that you're also a co-founder, I think, of their historical games network, right?
Yeah.
And if I understand correctly, this is exactly aiming at that, at bringing together not only people from different fields, but also academics and non-academics, as in game developers, makers, or other kind of cultural persons, people.
Yeah, no, exactly. The last category is a little bit more sort of people who are interested in cultural and heritage, and a little more freeform. Not that game makers is a super diverse group of people, as are academics, obviously. But yeah, I think definitely as much as to study games, to study sort of history and games, it has to be a kind of interdisciplinary sort of endeavor. There's no real there's not very many kind of ways of doing it, I guess, that are not, especially when you look at a company like Rockstar, these sorts of games, you can't really do it in a way that isn't having to draw from lots of different fields. So yeah, this is as much as you say, lots of different academic kind of fields and sort of perspectives and disciplines have sort of something to say or something to offer this. It's very much about recognizing that it's not just academics, obviously, who have a stake in this. And if we are, I suppose, to take seriously the fact that games can and do represent the past, they do sort of kind of offer historical narratives, they are a form of history that is worth taking seriously. We need to kind of have a much broader dialogue with different people who are interested in sort of making and using and kind of thinking about games. So that is sort of partly why one of the main reasons actually why the Historical Games Network was kind of why we founded it, what we wanted to do. We wanted to create this sort of space where people could come together and, you don't have to be an academic, you don't have to be a person who makes games, you don't have to be a sort of cultural worker. It's very much just about hearing different perspectives, giving a sort of a space and a platform for different and newer kind of perspectives in this field, sort of highlighting the work of early career academics, of independent sort of game makers, as well as sort of more mainstream game makers, and sort of freelancers or people who are more established in kind of the cultural and heritage industries. And really seeing where that, I suppose, takes the debate, where that takes the kind of the discussion and the discourse around history and games, and being as kind of broad ranging as possible in the kinds of voices that we're sort of listening to, who all have something to say about history and games.
Yeah, I think that's amazing that you're doing that, because that's exactly what, a lot of fields within only the history field need, and opening up to non-academics who often know not only as much, but more about the topic. So taking everyone seriously and getting them all together to talk and discuss is a brilliant approach to this.
Thank you. We try our best.
So this pretty much ends our book talk on that note. Just wanted to make sure that everybody got that your book will be out on August 22nd. It's called Rockstar Games and American History. And I haven't looked forward to publication more this year. So I can't wait to see the book. Thank you so much for coming here today, for talking about your book and all the interesting things in the book, and also what you're doing as a side project.
No, it's been lovely talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for everyone listening, watching. We'll be back with a different book soon. So thanks and goodbye.